Welcome everyone to the Infineon Tech 4 event. My name's Greg Williams. We're delighted you could join us this evening where we have a really exciting panel ahead for an amazing discussion on an incredibly important topic. So you've met the panelists, so let's just dive straight in, I think, and get into the conversation. So Andreas, I'd love you to start us off, please. So as we all know in this room, that sustainability, tackling climate change is humanity's greatest challenge at the moment. It's also hugely complex. It's very, very difficult undertaking. And I think because of this complexity, because of the challenge, many people, many organizations, they feel overwhelmed. They don't really know where to start. So how do you think about the ways in which progress can be made in this area? How can we have real impact? How can we create momentum?
Actually, my kids are very often asking me the same question, which is like, oh, Daddy, this feels like, and the whole topic of climate change feels like a huge mountain we are standing in front of, and when we're looking at the peak, we partially can't even see the peak. No matter of talking about is there any way to go up. So how to climb this mountain when it's so far out of reach and we feel so under-equipped in order to master this challenge. And here I tend to always say, look, it always starts, and every journey starts with the first step. So let's start moving and make a first step, which in the context of climate change and decarbonizing the planet is in essence two major themes. Theme number one, when you look into data, around about 2/3 of the global CO2 emission is asserted to the energy sector. So it's coming from burning coal, burning oil, and also burning gas. Tackling a consequent transition from fossil energy carriers towards renewable energy is a huge part of the solution. Something that, of course, one individual can hardly do, but we as a society, together with public sector, the private sector, can and must push forward as an obligation. The second point for sure is, and here it comes to more the individual theme, that another around about 20 percentage points of greenhouse gas emission goes back to the agriculture sector, in particular towards meat production. I was astonished to learn that each and every cow on an average day pollutes the planet with around about half a cubic meter of methanol. And methanol is one of the greenhouse gases that is fueling global warming going forward. So what can we do? Be very conscious in how we consume. Us being conscious in the nutrition we take, in the meat we eat, in the amount of meat, versus then also, so to say, veggie, if I may say. So that is something that I always recommend my kids. And since we've been entertaining these discussions, 2 of my 3 daughters have become vegetarian, and that's small, but definitely a step towards a solution going forward.
Yeah, well, I have kids who turned either vegetarian or vegan, so the issue is very much on people's mind. And Helen, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, because you are building coalitions of young people. Where do you think about focusing, and when the scope is so large and when there is such urgency to this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we actually did a project, the Global Youth Energy Outlook, last year, which surveyed 42,000 young people on how they were feeling and what they wanted to see for the energy transition through 2030. And we saw that the vast majority, I think it was over 85%, said that they were concerned or very concerned about the impacts of climate change. And at the same time, we've seen these rising movements of young people around the world over the past 5 years or so, really growing in numbers. So there are these alarm bells being rung by young people, but where we were seeing a bit of a disconnect is young people were indicating that they just didn't know how to actually make a difference and actually make change happen, whether it's at the political table, whether it's within institutions, whether it's within their communities. And so that's where we really came in and thought, okay, what's missing here? Where is that missing link between young people being highly, highly concerned and them really feeling like they have the tools to act? And around clean energy, we saw that there was definitely an information disconnect. Energy, I think, can really feel like quite a technical, and clean tech, I would argue as well, can feel quite technical, quite intimidating to get into unless you have a specific degree or a specific set of experiences. So we started first with demystifying what is an energy system and carving out those pathways for young people to feel like they could take on a project in their community, start talking to their peers, family members, community members. And that's when we really started seeing action happen and young people start to actually think, this is a career I want to make now. I want to move into clean energy jobs or green jobs and really keep doing this throughout my life. And so that's how we kind of create focus in this space is where are the gaps happening? How can we tackle those? And then from there, continue to support and kind of funnel young people into where they're most passionate.
And you think about it, sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
I'd just like to jump in there on the responsibility of the individual. It's really important that we all do take individual steps and changes in our personal lives, with our families, with the people we talk to, and then in the responsibilities that we have in the businesses and the organizations we work into. And I'll cover some of these later on, some steps that I think people can take. But 2 years ago, do you remember the thing called the pandemic? It seems long over now, but we went through a pandemic 2 years ago and everyone stopped doing everything. Everyone stopped doing everything. It was the biggest sacrifice pretty much all of us have ever made in our lives. We stopped flying, we stopped traveling, we stopped going out, we stopped doing everything. And global emissions dropped 4%. That was it. When everyone makes the biggest sacrifice they can to stay inside and really changes what they do, emissions barely drop. So yes, it's really important that we do keep changing as individuals, but it shows there's much bigger systemic problems that we need to address for these emissions to really drop further beyond the individual sacrifice, because heaping the responsibility of this purely on the individual is too much for anyone to bear. And when we all do it together, too much for us to all change if the systems that we have stay the way they are.
I think that also brings up maybe something, Claire, that you're working on, which is, sorry, Helen, which is around the fact that there are many things that are interlinked. So Andrew talked about it being systemic, and it isn't just about climate, is it? It's about a number of other issues that are all interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen from our network, young people are just as passionate about an energy transition as they are about an equitable energy transition, and that means addressing things like climate justice, energy justice, racial inequities, wealth inequities that exist in the world. So it is a systems challenge, absolutely, and young people are very driven to look at these systems in a really holistic way and see where they can start to really influence and try and make change as much as possible. So absolutely within sectors, we have lots of young people who run divestment campaigns on campus. That's a great way for them to start to kind of cut their teeth a little bit at looking at, some of the ways that they can really influence institutions that, may have more kind of power, I guess, than they currently do, but in numbers they're able to make a real difference. And we see the same thing with awareness building campaigns that they'll do and around making the linkage between food security and energy access. If we look at SDG 7, Sustainable Development Goal 7, which is clean, affordable, reliable, accessible energy for all, it really encompasses so many different dimensions that I think really speaks to how young people see the energy transition and climate action more broadly, as well as it needs to be holistic.
Yeah, and we're seeing this sorry.
But would you say it's predominantly the young generation which is about to save the planet?
What I see that they are? I mean, I hope not. I think it needs to be intergenerational, honestly. I'm a big believer in intergenerational collaboration. I think that there's so much more that young people can be offered in terms of actually having access to social capital and power in spaces where decisions are being made, policies are being changed, where young people can have more of a voice and be collaborators and partners rather than feeling like they can only play an adversarial role. So I think it requires everyone to come to the table, which I think is also speaking a little bit to what Andrew was saying about changing that system. Is all of us have a role.
I think it's fair to say that boomers are not going to save the planet. But Andrew, I wanted to bring you in here because we talked so much about sort of like technologists love to talk about innovation and governments love to talk about the fact that they're innovating and that they're driving innovating. It feels like it's a increasingly vague term, like it's almost becoming meaningless. So I'm really interested to get your perspective. And Shashank, sorry, I'm coming to you next. I'd love to bring you in next. I'd love to get your sense of like what we mean by innovation and how we can get the public and private sector to work best together.
So there's two parts of that question.
Yeah.
I won't spend too much time on unpacking the first part, but my personal view of innovation is more so about how can you do something differently or better, and then figuring out the path to get there. That is innovation for me, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's tied to technology. And sometimes getting to that destination actually means doing less. So for me, and that can be innovative in itself. That is behavioral change and systems change and societal change. That can be innovation and requires work around it to make those things happen. So that's my personal view on innovation. But how do we bring government and business and research together? That's something that Climate Kick especially focuses on. One of the main tenets of what we do, and for everyone here in tech, something you might be familiar with is systems as, services as a, SaaS. I forget the acronym, software as a service. We kind of deliver systems change as a service. So we sit between problem holders, like governments, predominantly local governments, like cities, but we also work with regional and national and continental governments. And then these are places that want to decarbonize. And then we find the players that operate already in these spaces or should be operating in these spaces and bring them together. And sometimes it seems logical that people in government in one area all talk together, but that's not the case. And it's the case even with corporates. You have people across a whole organization who do not know what the others are doing. So this is what we do. We facilitate all the various stakeholders to come together to decarbonize a place. And we've done this in Madrid. We've done this in the port of Valencia. We're doing it at the moment to make the country of Slovenia the first circular country in the world. And we're just starting a project with Ireland, the Irish government right now, to decarbonize their agricultural sector.
You talked a little bit there, Shashak, I want to come to you now actually. You talked a little bit there, Andrew, about doing less. And I guess that's a good place to start talking to you, Shashank, in terms of why can't we get to net zero just by reducing emissions?
Yeah, great question. So I will answer this in a purely quantifiable way. So, climate change is incredibly holistic. It's systemic. But, as an engineer, I like to think about things in numbers. And in many ways, I think about climate change as a math problem. And if you can see my slides, can you see my slides? Okay. Awesome. So basically, reduction.
We can't see the slides, I'm afraid.
You can see the slides. Okay. I'll just talk through it. Okay, there it is.
Talk us through.
So this is a graph by the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, talking about in 2018 for the first time they've shared, hey, in order for us to get to net zero, even if we were to decarbonize everything immediately, right? Decarbonize electricity, steel production, aviation, shipping, agriculture, literally entire economy, we are not going to get to net zero by 2050. And that's partly because there's already a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. We've already put about 2 trillion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. And we need to remove about 5 to 10 billion tons of CO2 per year to get there. So this, at the end of the day, it's just a math problem, right? Like, I mean, if it would have been nice to not be in the situation where only reduction was enough, but now every pathway that gets us to net zero has a significant amount of carbon removal from the atmosphere in the equation. So, going into the next slide, people ask, why can't we just decarbonize? So you think about, where do emissions come from, right? You can actually just, it's a very simple visual. There's a bunch of emissions that come from electricity. There's a bunch of emissions that come from industries and buildings. There's a bunch of emissions that come from hard to abate sectors like manufacturing, steel production, aluminum, concrete production, aviation, right? These industries are not so easy as buying an electric car or buying solar and wind, for example. These industries have, billions of dollars of capex already paid out to make the steel and concrete necessary to build the physical forms of this planet, that you literally have to retool that economy, retool those industries for them to be green and for them to not emit. And what carbon removal does is it accelerates and complements these decarbonization efforts, so that while we decarbonize, we also remove and we get to net zero together.
So I watched one of your presentations recently, Shashank, which was fantastic, and you talked a little bit about fast learning that's enshrined in something called Wright's Law. Just wondering if you could talk a little bit about Wright's Law, because it's been incredibly important for solar, which has been scaled amazingly here in Germany. How important is it for direct air capture, and what implications does that have for maybe other technologies?
It is absolutely, it's probably the main law that is important for us getting to net zero, period. I mean, I believe so much in that. And being at an Infineon conference, and this is one of the reasons this was interesting to me, was, you understand semiconductors, what has happened in the last 30 to 40 years. Moore's law has literally dictated the future of semiconductor. Like you can sit in 1970s and project out the cost per performance for integrated circuits, right? What does Moore's law say? Is that, every 18 months to 24 months, the number of transistors in an integrated chip doubles, right? That has been very predictable. And then, a lot of innovation in computing has revolved around Moore's law. And Wright's law is different, but what he talks about, it provides a reliable framework for forecasting cost declines as a function of cumulative production. Why is this important for climate tech? Is, well, literally, we have to retool the entire economy. We have to build factories that produce green steel. We have to build factories that produce green concrete. We have to build electric cars. We have to manufacture solar and wind. These are all infrastructure deployments. This is hardware, and we need to be able to project the costs for these things. And Wright's law provides a framework for that. So specifically what it states is that for every cumulative doubling of units produced, costs will fall by a constant percentage. And for example, automotive cars. Since 1909, for the last 120 years, Wright's law predicted the cost per horsepower consistently for the last 100 years. It's about 15%. So for every doubling in production, the cost per unit of a car went down by 15%. So, basically, right now, I think we've produced about 2.5 billion cars. So the next 15%, at least for combustion, not for electric, the next 15% won't happen until 5 billionth car, which is way later. But if you compare it to something that's way earlier in the adoption cycle, like solar, which actually has a really high learning rate, it's around 30%. One of the highest that humanity has ever seen. So for every doubling of solar panel production, we're seeing a 30% unit cost reduction. And that's one of the reasons why solar is so cheap today. So those are the things that give us confidence to the government, to a technology company. Oh, wow, if we just continue to deploy, these are the costs that we project, which means these markets open up, which means these are the emissions that we can reduce.
Thank you, Shashank. Andrew, you want to
jump onto that one quickly? I know our timer isn't working here.
So don't worry.
Okay, you keep your eye on it. You whip me if I'm going over.
No, plenty of time.
Shashank makes great points. However, this makes the assumption that the carbon withdrawal technology innovation happens in isolation, that nothing else is going on and there's no contrary innovations going on around the world. And the best example you gave there is about solar. Germany, the government invested heavily in solar in the 90s to subsidize it, and it's largely where things are at now. So thank you, the German taxpayer, for doing that. But in 2008, this line of code came out called Bitcoin. And in the 14 years since then, Bitcoin mining has basically eradicated the 50 years of research and energy and energy created and saved and emissions saved from solar. So it's great that we can, yes, we need to think, hey, we can innovate, and this is what our focus is. But it's also important to understand what's going on in the rest of the world, and that innovation doesn't happen in isolation of other things. And then this is where it comes into our point around technology, that technology by itself is not the answer to climate change, because technology is also one of the biggest drivers of climate change. And if the way the technology industry keeps working as it does, then the technology industry will be on the hook as much as the fossil fuel industry for the climate catastrophe that's coming.
Right, and Andreas, I'd love to bring you in here, and then Shashank, I'd love to come back to you, and then I'd love to come back to you, Helen.
Reflecting on what you said, Andrew, and I like that very much, technology in that sense is a part of the solution, but not the only solution. So when you look at the more holistic view on climate change and so to say different means in order to prevent or at least decelerate the planet from further climate warming, you need to look at things from a cultural, sociological, economical, but then also institutional perspective. Economical falls pretty much together then with the topic of new technology and innovating, but what about all the others? And here it comes back to, I think, what you hinted towards, which has to do with consumer behavior and us ourselves as human individuals. So I believe very much of the solution truly lays in us and in the way how we consume, in a more conscious consumption of mobility. So think about so to say, the topic of public transport versus always taking the car in order to get you from A to B in a city. And that, as an example, in my own experience, I tell you, it was painful to get myself away from always taking the car in Munich to drive from A to B to replace that by the bike. But topics like these, so behavioral, I call it, developments, can happen, and at the beginning they hurt, and later they stay part of an even better experience of day-to-day life, just as one example.
Yeah, I guess it's not binary. We obviously have Bitcoin mining, but we also have direct air capture. So I guess technology sometimes can provide a solution, but it also sometimes can be a problem. Shashank, I'd just love to come back to you with one more question, if you don't mind, please. So we're seeing billions poured into, like venture capital poured into direct air capture technology. What's your sense of when we're going to be able to scale this technology?
I think 2020s are going to be, in many ways, this is a multi-decade challenge. Like in 2070, we're still going to have to remove carbon from the air to ensure that we are within the 1.5 to 2 degree targets. In 2090, we'll still have to be removing carbon. So when you think about it, direct air capture as a multi-decade challenge, I think 2020s are really about getting it from the lab out to the real world and to real commercial deployments. For me, it's 2020s is a success for direct air capture if you're in the millions of tons by the end of the decade. So just to put that into perspective, millions of tons is something that actually, if you look at the latest sustainability report from Tesla, in all of its history so far, there's only about 5 million tons of CO2 direct impact they were able to make, which, for probably the most successful climate tech company, 5 million tons seems sort of small. But I think, for direct air capture, what we're doing is directly removing carbon. So our business model is the carbon credit. So we're able to, not have any intermediate forms of making impact. It's like for every ton we remove from the air, that's the climate is better off for it. And a lot of the success is going to depend. I support what everyone else is saying around systemic change and around policy. Direct air capture won't get to that scale without technology, policy, and capital working in unison together. Capital for low-cost financing and potentially helped by the government's policy, helping create markets. Just so what has been said about Germany offering subsidies, right? And I totally agree. I mean, it's at the beginning of a technology when the costs are expensive, you need a little bit of a fuel. You need a little bit of a fire that you need to light under these technologies, and that's what the Germany's subsidies in the 2000s has done. Basically, it created a market for solar, and that's going to happen for direct air capture as well.
So Helen, I'd love to come back to you now and really sort of like drill down, and thank you, Shashank, drill down on something that Andreas said, because Andreas talked about how difficult it was to change his behavior, to start cycling around Munich rather than use the car. How important do you think just challenging conventional thinking is? Like, how do we change our mindsets? We're so used to behaving in certain ways.
Yeah, it's a really tough one, and I think there is definitely some kind of uncomfortable pieces that will be a part of this. There's a lot of demand side reduction that needs to happen that just isn't talked about enough. But in order for that to be feasible and affordable for people, the right policies need to be in place so that public transit can get invested in and what have you, so that people can afford to make those choices. But in terms of changing values and mindsets so that people can just be more informed with the right information, feel like they have options available, can really visualize what those options are and see the benefits to them as well and to society about making choices. That's where I get really excited about mainstreaming climate and clean energy through education better. It's a huge gap that everywhere around the world, pretty much, for the most part, there are a couple of country exceptions, but everywhere around the world, for the most part, has really struggled to mainstream climate and clean energy education throughout programs, and that's at a primary, secondary, and post-secondary level. It's regardless of what kind of age you're at. I was speaking actually just the other day with the UK High Commissioner in Ottawa, and she was saying how she found out recently that her daughter actually was learning the exact same climate information in school as she had when she was in high school, and she was shocked by that, and that is really terrible. And what that does is if you're not teaching young people in those formative years where they're really solidifying their values and the things they find important, you're missing out on an entire generation that can start to make smarter, more informed choices that are aligned with their values. Climate, pro-climate being one of them. Another piece that I just want to add in here as well is, we've been seeing record low voter turnout in Canada, where I'm from. And I think in many other countries as well, getting young people out to actually vote for smart climate platforms is still a really, really big challenge. And this is, the education piece feeds into that as well. We recently, through our Global Youth Energy Outlook, saw that over 80% of young people would vote for a political candidate based on their platform on climate and clean energy. That's huge. But they're not right now learning enough about the issues and feel like they have access to what those platforms are and feel like they have candidates that they trust and that they're informed about, where they are motivated enough to show up and get out there and vote. So I think education is the baseline, and from there you just leverage that peer-to-peer engagement model, get people seeing that there are really strong career paths available to them as well to work on these challenges, and it's just a ripple effect.
I think, Andrew, you wanted to come in, and then we'll come to you, Andreas, please.
Thank you. Your question was around mindset. How do we change the mindset? And it's great that we need to address the education of young people coming through. But it's probably 20 to 40 years before these people are the CEOs. And they're going to make the big decisions. And they will then buy carbon removal technology, and things will change in 20 to 40 years. But right now, everyone in this room and your contemporaries need to change. And change is very uncomfortable. So what do we need to change so it doesn't feel like a sacrifice, so it doesn't feel like a complete mystery? We need a better imagination. And one example I think of this is reading things that aren't just fiction or non-fiction books and media. We need to look at our media diet. And a great example of something I would recommend everyone to do, one book you should read for the rest of the year, is called Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robertson. If you have not read this book, Ministry for the Future, you need to read this book. It came out in 2020. And what he does in this is he unlocks your ability to imagine a future that's not just the climate catastrophe, but imagine a future with different solutions and different pathways, and then you can get on board with it. And then you can get excited about change and see the opportunity. And only when you can imagine a different future and get excited by it, then you can go into the boardroom and make change happen.
Yeah, that's very strange you should say that. I actually interviewed him last week, funnily enough, and he has this phrase that made me think of you, Helen, because he talks about us all in this room being so-called good ancestors, people who are actually going to try and make change to sort of like, enable the future to be better. Andreas, you wanted to come in.
I wanted to get back to Helen and to the education system. So any practical examples of what can be done in terms of then also developing education systems, which typically are characterized by a lot of, let me call it, inertia?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it's really challenging. I mean, in Canada, for example, where I'm from, education's actually run by the provincial governments. And across our provinces, they all have fundamentally very different stances on climate and the clean energy transition. And so even getting buy-in across those different provinces to change all of those education systems to make them have really robust climate education is really, really hard just by the nature of how our government is structured. But I mean, I think that's where student energy comes in a lot of the time, and we shouldn't overly rely. Ideally, in 30 years, student energy doesn't exist anymore because there's no longer a need for us. But until then, organizations actually like Climate Kick as well, Student Energy, the European Youth Energy Network. There's lots of other kind of youth capacity building organizations that offer accelerator programs, incubator programs for more kind of tangible projects, but then also like baseline education around climate and energy right now. I know the International Renewable Energy Agency is currently actually developing a curriculum for teachers to adopt into their curriculums. And so it's actually a training program that's been designed to be mainstream through any program so that you're not just learning about climate in like your mandatory geography class. You're learning it in every single class, and it's kind of built into that that program. So they're in the process of building that, and they've brought in youth, they've brought in student energy, others to help kind of inform what that will look like. And so I think more collaborative efforts need to be made. We don't necessarily advocate directly for education policy change, but maybe we should be. I don't actually see a lot of other climate organizations doing that. So I think it's a bit of a gap right now, which leaves us with not a ton of best case practices. But Andrew, I feel like you might have...
This is something that Climate Kick has also been involved in from teaching high school students and providing across Europe in different schools, not the continent, not every school, but definitely part of programs that are enabling education around climate change in high schools and then in universities. And one of the goals behind this is actually to provide the workforce of the future. Because we need to give people the knowledge and education now so they can work for companies like Heirloom and Infineon when you're making microprocessors for carbon removal projects.
So to sum it up, climate change and prevent from climate change as a subject, that's something that would help a lot.
Yep.
Interesting point.
And you should learn it when you're learning about math. You should learn it when you're learning about history. It should all be baked in there. And then that becomes part of a core value system. And you have young people looking at, I think we've got like 40 million green jobs projected over the next couple of years by climate action. That's where young people really kind of are passionate about this and want to move into those jobs and work at companies like you said.
Shashank, I'd love to bring you back in here. So clearly, what the broad sort of like focus, I guess, of this conversation is that we require really public and private sector to coalesce around, really robust policy goals. We are seeing some of the work being done at the COP summits. How do you feel that we can, and I know that you're on the East Coast because you're talking to people in DC, policymakers in DC. How do you feel that we can accelerate what can sometimes seem like a really slow process? And I'd love, Helen, for you to come back on that and obviously the rest of the group.
Honestly, it's really what Ellen is talking about. For context for the audience, I'm in DC this week talking to policymakers, White House staff, Department of Energy staff about the importance of carbon removal and the importance of policy helping accelerate climate tech. And a lot of the conversations are about, hey, this is what your constituent base is really cares about. It's the constituent base, whether it's regardless of what side of the house, what side of the party line you're on, your constituents care about and worry about climate. And the great thing about climate tech in general is that it creates, a wealth of opportunity, right? And if we have an opportunity to retool this economy in a way that is racially just, that in a way that is, fixes the mistakes that we have made in the past. So we have an opportunity to create jobs and create new infrastructure that is new and valuable for the next few decades. So the main points I talk about really are twofold when it comes to policy. One is around making deployments easy, right? There's a lot of permits and constraints that are put on new infrastructure, mainly around protecting the environment. But those same laws are also hindering infrastructure that could help the environment, like carbon removal, right? Like the only goal for carbon removal technology is to help climate and the environment. So we need to make sure that those permits and all the local laws that slow that down need to be fixed. The other part of policy that we talk about is around creating markets and creating, things like the Germany subsidy. how do we make sure that the green premium for new technologies is as low as possible so that the market can adopt this and bring down the costs?
Do you just want to explain what a green premium is there, just for the audience?
Absolutely. So the green premium is the premium that you pay for a green technology compared to a status quo. So for example, if you want to take a truly a carbon neutral flight, right, to wherever you are, if you add in the cost of, say, the sustainable aviation fuel that is carbon neutral, that sustainable aviation fuel today is way more expensive than the jet fuel. So, if you, I think, depending on where you are, it's anywhere from 20 to 40% premium. And the lower that premium is, the more chances that it will have to actually be adopted by the entire market. There's a quote that Kim Stanley Robinson, the author of Ministry for the Future, talks about. He says, you can imagine the end of the world way before you can imagine the end of capitalism, which really talks about the power. This is a tool that we have. This is how the world works, right? For better or worse. And so the question is really, okay, how do we use the power of capitalism to go and solve these problems? And at the end of the day, these green technologies have to be economically superior than the traditional technologies. We can do behavior change, we can do systemic changes. At the end of the day, these need to be economically superior for them to actually be adopted by the entire market. And that means that the green premium has to be zero.
Thank you, Shashank.
Just to put a number on that sustainable aviation fuel, to fly, for me to come from Amsterdam to Munich with Lufthansa, this sustainable aviation fuel was an extra 150 euros on my flight, which doubled the cost of the flight. And so when you think about what is the impact of how many trips would we all be taking if suddenly our flights would double the cost?
Right.
And that's really what flying is going to have to start costing us. Not just do you want to, 0.2% of people click, do you want to offset your flight, which is negligible how much that actually works.
So do you think that all the externalities that we experience when we're buying, I don't know, cheap food, cheap meat, they need to be priced in if we're really to kind of get hold of this?
Yes, in simplest form. And to continue the Kim Stanley Robinson fan club, he has a great also in that book. I think it is the invisible hand never picks up the check, and it all comes back to who's paying, right? Who pays for these things to happen? And in this book, he proposes a solution which is from an Australian doctor called Delton Chen, and it's this concept of what's called a carbon coin, or Delton Chen calls it a global carbon reward, and it's basically using quantitative easing, so creating money out of thin air, to pay people to do the best thing for the climate and to stop them doing the worst thing for the climate. So basically paying countries like Saudi Arabia to keep their oil in the ground. And the thing is, people freak out when you think, wow, this is going to be a lot of money to print. But we've done it. We just did it for the pandemic.
Right.
We printed trillions of dollars from nowhere. And then the world went on. So we can print this money because it's all a myth and a belief system. We just have to want to imagine different and believe in a different system and then go and do it.
Andreas.
So I'm very much a friend and advocate of this in principle idea of, so to say, incentivizing people rather than punishing for making quote unquote right choices as far as decarbonization is concerned. And this flight example is a perfect one. So how many people would you find on the planet who voluntarily pay double the price for a ticket from Amsterdam to Munich in order to have a contribution towards then synthetic fuels versus so to say, the standard one and decarbonize. And that's exactly the point where I would say relying on individuals' choices in order to bring part of the solution to the problem has its limit. And that's where policy making is being asked for. And here I'm coming back to one of the problems that I was always scratching my head on when I was listening to Juncker, so the former president of the European Commission, who said, we all in the European Commission know the solution to the problem. but we have no clue on how to be re-elected afterwards.
Shashank, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's so interesting. We talk about the sustainable aviation fuel, costing $150 as a premium. It doesn't have to be that way. It is possible to get that down to zero. It is possible. And a clear example of that is going back to solar. 20 years ago, solar was about 20 times more expensive as it is today. Just 20 years ago, and the world has changed. Today, in many parts of the world, solar is cheaper than fossil fuel, right? And that didn't get there by itself. Germany and Chinese manufacturing and a bunch of other things has helped get there. And I think we can do that for sustainable aviation fuel. I think we can do that for food, for concrete, for steel, for the entire economy. And that requires, something called deployment-led innovation, where we deploy, and reduce costs down. And government plays a key role in sort of being very strategic about sort of pushing and pulling in different parts of the market adoption, just like it has with solar. So it doesn't have to be that way. I believe in our collective potential to reduce those premiums down to zero.
Helen, I'd love to bring you in now, but first of all, to remind everyone that we are going to be taking questions very shortly. And for those of you watching online, please do submit your questions. Helen, sorry, over to you.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think just to kind of pull the thread back a little bit to your initial question around COP and what does this conversation mean in the context of COPs going forward as well. I mean, I think a lot of what has been said here around basically creating more affordability, like how can we create more affordability, more access for people, drive down costs, through smart policies and other kind of market mechanisms. It ties a lot back to this conversation around equity as well. If we're talking about the global majority being able to have access to choices, and choices that are not just about protecting the climate, because that might not be their priority, frankly. If there are other development issues that they're facing, it might be about their health, and it might be about reliable access to energy in order to have access to education. Then yeah, you're talking absolutely about an affordability and accessibility challenge. So I think there's a way to tie this, as both a conversation around how we can get solutions deployed faster and at scale that will get us the emissions reductions or the emissions drive down that we need. We're also talking about how can we create more equity globally by making these options cheaper, more affordable, more reliable for people, the global majority of whom are getting hit hardest by climate right now. And I mean, even beyond climate, like over 700,000 people around the world, or 700 million people around the world still don't have access to reliable energy, electricity. Over 3 billion people don't have access to clean cooking. So, there's a lot going on where all of these solutions can really drive progress at multiple levels. So I think we need to look at that holistically, and that's where I think COP really comes in, is if we center those voices more of the global majority and really make sure that messaging comes across clearly while knowing that there are these kind of proven models for how costs can get driven down, we can have a much more holistic and powerful conversation about who we're really supporting here, which voices are being heard in the room, and how our solutions being designed with people really at the center. Which is a bit of a tangent, but I did want to pull it back to kind of the global equity piece, because I think it's really important not to miss sight of that.
Shashank, we'll come to you in a second. We're going to come to you, Andreas, first, and then on to Shashank.
Deploying all these policies and policy-related technologies definitely requires a lot of courage, if you will. So coming back to what I mentioned earlier, it is not that straightforward with regards to, so to say, deploying solutions to make and facilitate or accelerate the transition from fossil energy towards renewables, not because there is certainly some price consumers have to pay for that, pardon, and also some price the one or the other industry has to pay for that. So having said that, such measures to do the true acceleration out of gas, which is the name of the game today, and out of coal, also as a function of inflation and energy prices becoming unaffordable, and making sure there is fair energy prices in market. So for policymakers, that's a huge, huge challenge going forward to then also dare and start daring to dare, while not having clearly at the end of the horizon the idea of I'm going to be re-elected. And I believe As a matter of fact, it takes us as individual private people in the private sector, but also it takes us as today here and also in the auditory as industry leaders and, if you will, role models within the area of our influences to individually push forward the little contributions that we can do. So self-obligation for private people and also self-obligation for companies is something where everybody who today is here can give his or her contribution to solution of the problem.
Okay, Shashank, we'll then come back to you, please.
Yeah, I wanted to add to Helen's point about global equity. The worst impacts of climate change are faced by the world's most vulnerable, people who are already vulnerable to many other factors, and this just exacerbates that. And then these are the people who had little to do with creating the problem in the first place, right? So it's deeply, deeply unfair. And just look at the heat waves in India, or the rising waters in Bangladesh, right? So I think technology, being an engineer, I think about how can technology help address the deep equity problems. And again, I keep coming back to solar because I think it's just such a beautiful technology. Solar helped many parts of Africa and even India to skip over the need to go coal or other. You didn't have to build a whole electricity grid to get electrons, right? Solar is able to directly, it's a modular technology, and it can take the potential of photons from the sun anywhere. So you're able to be truly distributable and modular, and solar did that. And I think that's technology has a potential to be cheaper and more scalable and better for the end consumers, especially in these underdeveloped countries. We just need to put our creative hats on. Yeah.
Thank you, Shashank. So I'd love to go to questions now from the audience or comments from the audience. Has anyone got anything there? Gentlemen here. I think we've got a roving microphone that's going to come to you so that people at home can hear what's being said.
Yeah, thanks so much for the great discussion. I was wondering about this attractive idea of direct carbon capture, or CCS, carbon capture and sequestration. It seems very seductive as a story, and it's something that there's a lot of hype about at the moment, and also something that the fossil fuel industry seems to really like, right? Because it's in a way saying that, don't worry, in 10 years we'll be able to just take gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. So in a way, is there a risk that could be a bit of a distraction from the transformations of the industries that we've been hearing about? If one thinks of, we can keep on doing business as usual, more or less, and don't worry, in 10 years' time we'll be able to just suck it out of the air.
Shashank, I think probably this is one for you.
Yeah, I probably get asked this question about at least once a week these days. So yeah, I mean, it is a great question and an important one. The way you lead companies like this, it's not just about technological leadership, it's also about value leadership. We haven't taken, our company, Heirloom, we haven't taken a single oil dollar. And trust me, I get pinged on LinkedIn every week by these oil companies wanting to play a hand. And I see the potential and the moral hazard where they see this as a greenwashing mechanism. And for us, personally, I'm doing this because I care about improving equity in the world, and I think climate change is really the biggest threat to equity. And through that lens, I know that reducing emissions is the first and foremost things we have to do. Efficiency, reducing emissions through switching to electric cars, solar and wind, decarbonizing steel, using sustainable aviation, like reducing emissions is the first and foremost thing, period. However, that's not going to be enough. It is necessary and important to complement that by removing carbon out of the air. So we only build partnerships with companies, and we only sell carbon credits to companies who have clear agendas. Stripe and Shopify, all our customers have a clear dual goal. hey, we are reducing our emissions and we are removing carbon from the air. And I think that's sort of a values answer. And there's the economic answer to that is that it's actually way more expensive to remove carbon out of the air than it is to reduce emissions. So you can't just get around the problem of reducing emissions if you have a net zero goal. CO2 is only one molecule out of every 2,500 molecules out of the air. It's a hard technical challenge. It's not going to be cheap. And we're building a modular and scalable and low-cost technology to make it cheap, and so that the entire world can adopt it and reverse climate change. But it's still, solar is cheaper in many ways. So we need everything. We need, I don't like to say this, but like we need everything in the and the kitchen sink to go after this massive problem that is climate. Yeah.
Andrew wanted to come in.
I like to think of a visual of being in a fishing boat out in the middle of the lake, and your boat starts taking on water, but this water is actually carbon emissions, right? And your boat starts sinking, and you think, I got to get to shore before I sink. And what are you trying to do? You're trying to bail out water, and you're wishing you had a better, faster boat, or trying to plug these leaks. That's a little bit of the situation that we're in at the moment. If you just focus on bailing out water, which is what carbon removal is, and you've only got a cup to do it, then chances are you'll still probably sink. But if you just focus on having a faster boat, and then you will probably also not make the shore. So you need to do everything at the same time. But the International Panel on Climate Change, the crazy thing is all their recommendations rely heavily upon carbon capture and storage for things that don't really exist yet. And imagine that you're the CEO of a company and someone tells you the future of your business completely relies upon things you can't even imagine what they are yet. That's the situation that we're in. And so there's a lot of faith that needs to be put in it. There's a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of things need to be changed, but that's the situation we're at the moment. It'll be different in 10 years. So to your question, there is a huge risk if people just rely on this silver bullet, and that's what a lot of the fossil fuel companies are doing, the silver bullet of carbon removal, and they keep doing polluting here and withdrawing there. That's a huge risk, and we can't allow that to happen.
Yeah, building on that one, we simply cannot wait until carbon capture comes. It's potentially too late, and we have reached too many tipping points. So just the other week, there was this Austrian climate summit happening, and latest information was shared on global warming. And according to recent policies that are about to be deployed by the nations, instead of reducing the global CO2 emission relative to 1990 as a starting point by 45 percentage points till 2030, we're about to increase those by 14%. And minus 45 is the must-do target in order to come close to the 1.5 degree. Yeah. So having said that, we are miles away with policies and, so to say, defined national and, so to say, transnational actions defined in place in order to get us closer. So in essence, it is very late, and we must start, or not start, but continue doing. At the very end, we are held accountable by our kids, by our grandchildren, regarding the planet and the heritage that we do leave. And I want to, then when I'm older, look back, not with shame, but with something in my eyes, which I can truly state used to be a small little contribution to the solution. And this solution typically lies in us.
Question in the front row there, please.
It's a very beautiful discussion, and I would like to point a little bit more on us as humans, because we discussed that several times. We need a mindset shift, we need to do a transformation on how we live, we need to change our behavior, and this is so quickly said. But from my background, I'm a chemist and I'm enthusiastic about evolutionary anthropology. This is my hobby, so to speak. I love to investigate how we became humans as we are today. So being a food chemist, food scientist, I ended up being a sensory scientist, investigating how we perceive foods, our environment, products. why and how we consume in the way how we do it. And it is so striking then when you go on with your analysis of such behaviors in environments, in institutions, in companies. It is frustrating to say so, but we are not so far from our ancestors. We are, and I think it's high time to really thoroughly consider our behaviors and how we are driven to work and live how we do. And it is frustrating when you look at such emotions and on such sensations. It's so striking how much we are driven by fear. And we are so much primed on behaving in a way that we fulfill our KPIs, and that our companies are successful, and that everybody admires us, and so forth, and that we have our social status. And this factor of fear is striking. But another very interesting emotion is fun, joy, and social collaboration. And we need to shift to change our behavior, to couple our KPIs to the fun factor of life with the benefit of what we want to achieve together. So whenever I am sitting in such media or in such meetings, it's all about how to change technology for the better of production, to achieve more energy, whatsoever stuff. But it's very rarely discussed how to employ technology to change us as humans and our behavior, and to help us and to support us to get more joy from collaboration, to have success, to have admiration, for example, for whatever we do, and if it is in respect of sustainability, especially with regard to that. And I think the most important question nowadays, what we need to do is how to transform us as humans in our behavior so that everybody appreciates what we do, even if the numbers are not so nice, even if we don't make millions or billions or whatsoever, but to have a party, that we reduce CO2, that we avoided CO2, that we raised some more trees or whatsoever stuff with regard to sustainability, and to make it a game and to enjoy and to make it a matter of admiration. Because we are driven simply by social admiration. And the worst that can happen to us is fear and losing that.
Andrew, you wanted to come in there?
That was a fantastic point. Thank you for sharing, and it sounds like a really interesting pastime. I'm aware we only have 7 minutes left, so I don't want to take up too much more space. But for me, that comes back, how do we make us change? And I don't know the exact answer, but I hinted on where I think it needs to go before, and it's around imagination. It's something that I love to imagine, because imagining is fun. We used to do it so much as kids, and then it just goes out the window. The school system tells you stop imagining because this is what maths is. 2 + 2 = 4, not 2 + 2 = a purple dinosaur. We get told to stop imagining, or stop imagining good things and fun things. And so how do we bring that back into what we're doing? And one of the things I started to imagine recently was like, what would happen if we just flipped it and we did a 2-day work week instead of a 2-day weekend? Our emissions actually go off a cliff, and we'd have a lot more time to enjoy doing things we want. And there's many studies that show when people, humans, do not work, they do lower emission activities. We think we're all going to fly everywhere, but that's actually not the case. When people have time off, they spend it with families, they spend it at home, they do lower emission things that give them value in their life. And that requires an imagination. People say, oh, you won't earn enough, inflation will be too high, we won't get enough done. What about people in health? Great questions, but you've got to imagine the answer to it. Because the potential win of doing a 2-day work week and a 5-day weekend to spend it with your kids, spend it with whoever you want, whether it's your cats, your plants, whatever, what a great life. So let's try to imagine a bit more.
I'm sold. Helen, did you want to come back on that?
Just really quickly, because I think this is so important. I get really alarmed. I mean, I feel this myself too. I'm still technically a youth as well, but I get really alarmed by the young people in my network who I see just constantly in burnout mode. And they're stressed. They're stressed about climate change. They're stressed also just about finding decent work where they can live and afford to kind of be at the standard in which kind of society dictates we need to be living, whether that's owning property or starting a family or what have you. And there's an affordability crisis right now for young people, I think, around the world, regardless of, unless you come from a lot of privilege. And so, this deep-rooted anxiety that I'm seeing causes me a lot of concern, and I guess compounds my own anxiety about climate and all of those things. But I think there are solutions that I get really excited about. I think bringing back this sense of collectivism and community over individualism is really important. That's a fundamental culture shift I would love to see emphasized more in these conversations. I think even throughout the pandemic, we saw a bit of a resurgence of like community gardens, more kind of community sharing programs where there isn't a transaction being had, but it's about sharing and building relationships and supporting each other. And so I think that if we can bring a lot of those values back, we have a lot of opportunity there, whether it's about like community-owned energy systems or what have you. There's so much to do there. I think also more powerful positive storytelling. I think something that does fuel a lot of anxiety in people right now about whether it's kind of succeeding in work and society, whether it's tackling the climate crisis, is just that we're really inundated with a lot of really scary information or bad news about what's going on. And there is a lot of it, absolutely. But if we're going to get people to feel hopeful and see climate solutions as a way to find joy and want to work together and want to tackle that, we're going to have to get better about positive storytelling. And there are so many cool people doing really amazing things on climate that we need to be showcasing more. And get people inspired to start, doing it themselves. And more stories as well that kind of talk about communities and groups working together and less about individuals, like the kind of like CEO figure. Not that CEOs are bad at all, but, I think more talking about like, about how people are working together in new and interesting ways, I think would also be really inspiring. So that would be my 2 cents on bringing more positivity and joy to this space.
Okay, we have just 3.5 minutes left, so I'd love to get through some of the questions that are coming through from people watching online. So, Andreas, maybe you can take this first question. I'm going to read it out for everyone in the audience. They can hear the question. So, how can companies like Infineon play their role for a sustainable future without any impact on the bottom line?
Now, for Infineon, decarbonization is a purpose. It's a business purpose. And the more we develop innovative technologies that become part of the solution, renewable energies, the electric car, storage stations and things like that, the more we contribute towards then also value creation amongst our customers and then also ourselves as consumers of all these fancy technologies willing to pay a certain price tag. And that in the end can be captured back into the P&L, allowing a company like Infineon to do much more with regards to making us faster, net zero, than actually required by whatever legislation. And here this so-called self-obligation to get net zero till 2030 is something which myself on behalf of Infineon is pretty proud of. So, but it's a circle. It's a business purpose that all of a sudden when innovating allows you to reinvest into decarbonization yourself.
So we're pretty much out of time, but I just want to quickly run around the panel with one final question, which is just to take a look forward, really. So Shashank, maybe you can start if you don't mind. So I'd love to just understand from all of you what you think let's be positive. What's the best case scenario for where you think we'll be in maybe 10 years when we're thinking about technology and a sustainable future?
Yeah, I think about this through this quote that you may have heard. Humans underestimate how much we can do in 1 year, humans overestimate how much we can do in 1 year and underestimate how much we can do in 10 years. And mainly because our minds are not very exponentially minded, and fundamentally change and systemic change and technologies are exponential in nature, and we cannot imagine so far into the future. And that's why storytelling and imagination is so important, that we can get there. However, even that statement of us underestimating how much we can do in 1 year, actually, I have to reassess that now, because I've seen, during the pandemic, within about a year, we went from lockdown to millions of people being vaccinated. That's R&D, manufacturing, and massive distribution challenges in the middle of a pandemic that we were able to do. If humanity as a collective really believes something needs to happen, human ingenuity comes to the rescue, and making the impossible possible. So, I truly believe in creativity and technology to get us there. In 10 years, I think, we can get some of these breakthroughs and really start deploying. We don't have time to still continue to make, look for new technological breakthroughs 10, 15 years from now. We have to get those done in the 2020s so we can focus on deploying them and actually get to the emissions impact in the 2030s and beyond.
Thank you. Andrew, what's your kind of best case scenario for the next 10 years?
Can I still sit on it for a minute and come back?
Sure. Helen, any thoughts?
For the next 10 years?
What would you like to see in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about the different elements that I would love to see. I would love to see what a fundamental societal mindset shift could look like. Just seeing people behaving differently, making different choices, voting differently at scale. That would be really incredible. Young people in our network are going to be, about maybe starting to get to the age of 30. I would love to see every job that they're moving into, and this is, with the assumption that we're working with the current kind of conditions of society, every job that they're working in is a green job. That's something that I'm working on a lot right now, is how do we equip young people with green job skills? Because it's something that a lot of sectors are getting really excited about, is this prospect of green jobs, and countries as well, governments are getting really excited about it. So is there a way that we can really position young people and equip young people as the best people to be in those green jobs? Others should be in them as well, but I get really excited about bringing young people into that space because I think that will just bring a level of kind of ambition and passion and drive that we really need. So yeah, every job is a green job in 2030.
Great. I love that. Andreas?
Yeah, best case in 10 years from now, 2.2 degrees C global warming, far away from the 1.5 degrees C Paris target. I still consider that a stretched goal, and striving for what appears to be unachievable to later then achieve what is possible. That's a bit what I'm advocating all of us to do. Translating 2.2 degree into what it means that from now onwards, all the policy making, which while we speak is pretty clear, exit from fossil into renewables. So to say, changes in behavior, and then also policy making towards a more sustainable agriculture, many other elements that have to do with private consumption behavior, but then also industry, politics, and means that are being put in place. If all of that happens, we have a chance for 2.2. Just to illustrate what that means, because I was myself looking into that a little bit deeper. So I'm coming from the Alps. And in the valley where I'm living, this 2.2 degrees C, I thought that's not so much. But when you translate it to the alpine climate, it means that the average temperature in that area where I live is up 5 to 6%. And that means in the middle of the Alps, I'm going to be confronted with a climate surrounding which is similar to what Rome looks today. 40 tropical nights, which is above 20 degrees C, no cooling at night. So today, the average in my village where I'm living is 9 days, tropical nights per year in average. That's where we're heading towards. And that what, on the other hand, is also motivating me so much to truly not surrender and strive for the unachievable, do what can be done by self-obligation and my own consumption behavior in mobility, in nutrition, and I would say entertainment consumption per se, in order to be a little contributor to the solution going forward.
Andrew, do you want the final word?
That's fantastic. I don't deserve the final word. And I can't add much to this because they're fantastic responses. I can just say that I hope that in 10 years, all of us, whether at an event like this again, we reflect back at this moment and it will just seem foreign and weird that we ever were in this situation, that it was a smaller group of people, that wasn't everyone working towards changing our world and changing our industry. And that's just what I hope, that by that point our minds have completely changed, that the early 2020s and beyond just seems like a bizarre, distant memory.
Well, thank you all for ending on such an optimistic note. Thank you, Shashank. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Andreas. And thank you to all of you for participating, being part of this very, exciting event. And I think, touching on something that really is something that I think all of us need to be focusing on in our personal lives and our professional lives. Thank you so much for Infineon for throwing the Tech4 event, and enjoy the drinks this evening. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Someone.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks
That was
so
fun.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
Thank you.
Well done.
Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.